So this podcast episode is a little bit of a soapbox one. Why is it we can talk freely about domestic abuse and be met with sympathy, be met with compassion, but when we say narcissistic abuse, we're met with eye rolling, judgment, leaving us filled with shame? Well, that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about on today's podcast: domestic abuse, narcissistic abuse, which are both trauma. Massive welcome, my friends, to Trauma and Narcissism Redefined, your weekly podcast, hopefully taking you through lots of pieces of education, hope, stories, and a little bit of humour thrown in, because at the end of the day, wherever you're listening or even watching this, because it is on YouTube as well, wherever you're listening and watching this from, I like to put my podcast on in the car actually when I'm driving after I've dropped my daughter off at school, and I put a podcast on then and just catch up with everything. Wherever you're listening this from, hopefully you want it to be a little bit of education, inspiration, and a little bit of fun as well. You know, I hope they're not too boring. Don't want to be boring by any stretch. But it is a really, really important topic that I want to talk to you about today, because we see so many domestic abuse charities and centres, and when people talk about domestic abuse, the problem with only talking about domestic abuse is a number of things, and that's what I want to talk to you about on today's podcast. Because when I came out of my relationship with my ex-husband, I didn't even realise I had been in an abusive relationship. So there's the first thing. I think many of us think of relationship abuse, like domestic abuse, being bruises and broken bones. But there are many different forms of domestic abuse, like psychological, emotional, FGM, which is female genital mutilation, honor-based killings. There are so many different sorts, like financial abuse. So it's not just the broken bones and bruises. And I think that was where my issue was when I was in my abusive marriage. He cheated. So I looked at a behaviour like cheating and thought, well, I know that's not right, but he's just, let's face it, just a cheater. I didn't understand the nuances of the psychological and emotional abuse and the financial side of it, because I gave up work. I was totally reliant on him financially, which is likely why I stayed in the relationship, because how could I survive as a stay-at-home mother with 2 children and be this single parent? And I thought, I don't want my kids to be from I cringe when I say this now, broken home, because that's what society says, doesn't it? We have to have the archetypal 2 parents. No, you need one happy parent and one who's working on themselves mentally. So it's so important for us to recognize that there are many different forms of intimate partner violence without it actually being physical. I was at an event, it must have been about 3 or 4 months ago now. I was speaking at an event around domestic abuse. And I obviously brought in the narcissism piece too, which everybody could relate to. But there was about 4 women in there that were, as they were going through their divorce and filling in some of the forms, there's questions about abuse and is it present, and they thought no. They thought they weren't in an abusive relationship because the person had never laid a hand on them. And that is not the case. You know, the scars that are within from the psychological and emotional run equally, if not more deeply, than the physical bruises and the broken bones. Now, none of it is acceptable in any intimate partner relationship. But it's really important to recognize the nuances around intimate partner violence and relationships that aren't to do with bruises and broken bones and the physical aspect, because we see a lot of convictions that may come from physical abuse, but there are very few, certainly here in the UK, where coercive control is actually against the law now, but there are hardly any convictions. It's very difficult to prove, which means people can feel very, very isolated. Now, when we start to talk about domestic abuse, and then we bring in narcissistic abuse, and I see this because, narcissism for me is something that I'm really, really passionate about, because I think it's really misunderstood. It's an overused word in our society. Everyone's ex or your boss or whoever isn't nice, they're this narcissist. And the problem with overusing the word incorrectly is it diminishes the experiences of those like me, like you, who have actually experienced abuse at the hands of a narcissist. Now, narcissistic abuse is domestic abuse. It is domestic abuse when you're in that intimate partner relationship. But what we're doing is we're saying you're being abused by a narcissist. Now, interestingly, the question is, are all domestic abusers narcissists? Is that what they are? And the potential answer is perhaps not all. And for us to say perhaps not all, we need to understand really what a narcissist is. Now, I see narcissists differently to the medicalization. Now, we have medicalized narcissistic personality disorder. It's one of the 10 personality disorders listed in the DSM, which is a book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders that psychiatrists and psychologists may use to diagnose certain conditions. And there's lots of others in there. It's a great big thick book. The problem with being that we've medicalized it, we have these 9 traits that are listed in the DSM, and for someone then to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, they need to exhibit 5 or more of those 9 traits. Now, there's a number of issues there. Firstly, there's way more than 9 traits of someone who is an actual narcissist. And the second problem is, for someone to get a diagnosis, they need to acknowledge that there's an issue to go to someone to get the diagnosis. And for many of us, we know narcissists will not admit that it is them because they are always projecting outwardly. That's the nature of what a narcissist is. So therein lies the issue, and that's why I don't talk about narcissistic personality disorder. I use the word as a descriptive term for a series of abusive behaviors and traits and responses that really become pervasive through an individual's life. Now, narcissists aren't born this way. They are deeply wounded individuals, and that core emotional wound is so painful to them that they have all of these responses, behaviors, and emotions that come up for them, and we call these protector parts in internal family systems, that project outwardly to basically mean it's your fault. You know, anything that happens in their lives, it will be your fault or somebody else's fault, because the alternative for a narcissist is to turn inward, and that is too much for a narcissist's inner system to actually comprehend. Now, they have put little scans on brains of people who have had diagnoses, and there are differences and there are physiological changes in the brains of narcissists. They have far less, if any, mirror neurons. And mirror neurons are responsible for things like empathy. And many of us who end up in these narcissistic relationships are highly codependent. We have a real lack of self-love, which actually narcissists are too. But ours is on a different level with the different parts of us that show up to protect us. And, you know, also, many of us are empaths. Now, we are born empaths. We have a heightened amount of mirror neurons in our brain, which makes us an even more magnet to a narcissist because we want to make things better. Because if they're not better, we see that as a reflection of ourselves. So being an empath and a codependent is a magnet to a narcissist. Now, when we think about, are all narcissists domestic abusers? Yes, because they do abuse. But are all domestic abusers narcissist? Now, there's a key difference that we can differentiate between somebody who is abusing and they aren't a narcissist and someone that is. There are some people that are abusive that aren't a narcissist because they will still take ownership and responsibility for their behavior and try and do something about it. For instance, someone maybe who's an addict. You can't be in a relationship with an addict without it being abusive. It's just nigh on impossible if there is an addiction, because at some point, because of their addiction driving them, there will be probably likely forms of emotional and psychological abuse. So, you know, all addicts in those relationships at some point will become an element of abusive behavior within that relationship. But they will take ownership, some of those in that. They acknowledge that they have a problem. They acknowledge that their behavior is unacceptable. That doesn't then make them a narcissist. Many domestic abusers will be narcissists because it will be hidden. They won't take any ownership. Any abuse that they do perpetrate against an individual, they will create reasons why they are doing that. And that reason will be it's your fault in some way. You shouldn't be doing this or you shouldn't be doing that. So the majority of domestic abusers who don't take ownership and responsibility, who have a complete lack of empathy and project that outwardly all of the time to it being your fault, yes, they are a narcissist. Now, the problem then with having the majority of domestic abusers as narcissists is it will not change, meaning to change the situation, we need to support the survivors that are in these relationships to actually feel safe enough to exit, because safety is the number one priority. Literally, more murders and homicides happen in the first 7 days of leaving an abusive relationship than any other time. And very often that's why many people stay in these abusive relationships, because it's actually safer for them to do so. So it is really important that if you're in these types of relationships and you're feeling stuck and you don't know where to go, make sure you reach out. Either reach out to myself and my team, and you can do that on email, you can do that via Instagram or Facebook, or reach out to some of your local domestic abuse centres. Most places will have a local domestic abuse charity and a local domestic abuse centre. So please utilise those and do it safely. There are things you can do to safely exit an abusive relationship, to prep in anticipation of that. I would never say to someone in an abusive relationship, just leave then. The dynamics and complexities of why somebody stays, all I would be doing if I said that is putting them in danger and shaming them about why they have stayed. That is not the type of language that we want to use to people who are in abusive relationships. And if they're in abusive relationships with narcissists, it won't ever change. But for many of us, we're desperately wanting it to change. And we've tried many, many times. And, there's lots of stats that even people who leave relationships, sometimes it can take up to 48 times for them to realize that they need to leave before they leave. And then 7 times of leaving, going back before somebody actually leaves. And that isn't anybody being weak. That isn't anybody being stupid and going back in these relationships. Our body is driven by our nervous system trying to keep us safe. And that means sometimes it feels safer to be in a relationship with an abuser because breadcrumbs of love are better than none. There's the trauma bonding and the addiction to the physiological secretion of hormones that happen when we're in these abusive relationships. And also the threats. If you leave, I will. So people stay in these relationships, and as a society, we must not judge people like that. We need to support them in a safe way. So when we're looking at, are all domestic abusers narcissists? Not all, because many domestic abusers will have other toxic traits like addictions, maybe anger even, because of their own past experiences. But if they're getting support and help with that and taking ownership and responsibility, there could be hope. But even when we start to look at the stats of the perpetrator programs that are in many domestic abuse centres, a lot of them, they reoffend. The stats aren't great, but there are some stats to say some do, but not narcissists. And that's why when we talk about narcissistic abuse, it can encompass domestic abuse. They won't change, and that enables them, the survivor who is in that relationship, to recognize there's nothing I can do here to change this situation. So if I'm in this situation, nothing will ever change. So I need to get external help and support for myself to help be the change. And that is a process. And I think it's so important. The word narcissist is overused. I hear you, I get it. It's so misunderstood. It's not just someone who is horrible on occasion. Hey, we can all be horrible on occasion, right? It's about somebody who has no empathy, projecting their pain outwardly all the time. It is always your fault. Gaslighting, manipulation, control. And it can be very different publicly to privately, So I want you to know that narcissistic abuse, we should be using that because domestic abuse still gives an element of change. Maybe they will change. Narcissistic abuse really drives home, they will not change. The only way your life will be different is if you start to heal your inner wounds as to why you are in these relationships and create a safe exit strategy to leave. So I hope that was really helpful. This is why I keep shouting about narcissistic abuse, because, you know, the word narcissist is so important for us survivors. It's not for anybody else. You know, scroll on by, don't listen. You know, and people get so het up about the word, but it's such an important word for us as survivors because it means they won't change. It means that there's no empathy, there's no responsibility, and it allows us to almost free ourselves of thinking things will get better. Because they might on occasion, but then it will always go back to the discard phase. It will always go back to that sense of abuse at some particular point. That's why I will keep shouting about narcissistic abuse, because it does enable us to really see a whole picture when we say that word. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote my book, which is out for pre-order right now with Hay House, called How to Heal After Narcissistic Abuse. I'll pop the link in the show notes for you because I'm offering a free gift of healing codependency, which is why we end up in these relationships, with the pre-order of the book. I'm gifting it to you. So you can just order that in the show notes below, and it's out on the 16th of July, but it'll get your pre-order in so you can get your free gift too as my thank you to you. But that's why I keep shouting about it. Yes, I get stick from it. Yes, I get the odd trolley posts and stuff like this on Facebook and on Instagram. But you know what? I'm going to keep shouting about it. I'm not going to be silenced about it. I want people to be educated about this, because narcissistic abuse is domestic abuse, but it's by a narcissist who will not change. And we need to be talking about all of this. I told you I'd get on my soapbox about all of this, because people demonize us for using that word, and it needs to stop. It's a great descriptive word for us as survivors to recognize so many different things. So I hope this was really helpful for you. Let me know, drop me an email or send me a message on Instagram or on Facebook. And if you're watching this on YouTube, pop a comment below. You know, let's start conversation, nice conversation. Let's be kind. Even if you disagree, that's okay. But ultimately, let's debate in an adult friendly way, because the number of times if I get trolley comments, I'm thinking, I work with narcissists and narcissistic abuse. It's just almost like, oh, we're catching you out, are we? And that's why you're having to project. So it's just a nice little delete and a block to that person. No point arguing, because ultimately I'm arguing with someone who wants to win. And whatever I say, I could say the sky is blue, they'll say it's black. You know, whatever. I give them £1 million, it's like not enough. So it isn't worth having those arguments. So I hope this was really helpful to you. And remember, narcissistic abuse isn't your fault, but you can take ownership and intentionally start to heal yourself to exit and stop attracting narcissists into your life. And I know this because this was me. This was my situation as well. It's not easy, but my goodness, is it worth it? And you can do that. So remember, it's not your fault, but take some responsibility. What can you do right now? Even if it's binge listening to my podcast, even if it's coming and joining my free group, which we'll pop the links in below too. Take those first steps. Surround yourself with people who understand. Surround yourself with people who won't shame you, won't judge you, but will just cocoon and support you. Take care, my friends. See you on the next episode of Trauma and Narcissism Redefined.